When the Heaven's Gate mass suicides occurred, which is 1997, so for those of the viewers and listeners who may need a sort of refresh, this was the group which ended with mass suicides. Hellbop Comet was overhead. They had a home in Rancho Santa Fe, which is outside of San Diego, California, and they believed they were freeing their souls to follow the UFO, which they believed was following Hellbop Comet. And all 39 active members of the group exited their bodies, as they referred to it. So this happened in 97. I was a college student at the time, and I was taking a course on Messianism and millennialism. So Messianism, beliefs about the Messiah, and millennialism, beliefs about the end of the world. And it was taught by an older Jesuit fellow who was focusing primarily on ancient and early medieval examples. But I asked him, hey, can I study this group? Because it seems like it's somewhat relevant. And he said, sure, go ahead. So I started researching it, and it became the focus for my senior thesis when I was an undergraduate. And then I never really left it aside when I went into grad school. And then as I started to study new religious movements professionally, I always wanted to come back to Heaven's Gate. So it took me a while. It wasn't my first book, but it was something which I kept thinking about, and I really wanted to understand the story and truly try to understand the people and the very sort of extreme, radical decision they made to end their lives.
Yeah.
So that's got into it.
Mm-hmm. And can you define, the Heaven's Gate is referred to as a new religious movement. Can you define what that means, what a new religious movement is?
Sure, yes. So there's different ways of defining it. Maybe the easiest is to say that it's a term scholars came up with because we don't like the term cult or sect, both of which have sort of pejorative meanings. The example I often give is if you're in Texas, Southern Baptists are the establishment. If you're in Russia, Southern Baptists are legally described as a cult, or the Russian equivalent of a cult. So cult has come to mean a religion we don't like. It used to have a much more rich sociological meaning, but scholars are really hesitant saying something is a cult because in the popular parlance, people think, well, that means it's a bad religion. Right. So what we tend to have meant by cult or sect is that they're small, they're newly formed, they usually have a charismatic leader. We don't mean to castigate them or make any value judgment about them. So we shifted to that term new religious movement instead of cult or sect. But I like it because it's really broad. A new religious movement is not a new religion. It's a social movement. That's where the movement comes from. So it doesn't need to have all of the sort of the fully fleshed out forms that we expect in an actual religion with sacred texts and holidays and practices and places of worship. Sometimes it's very sort of inchoate. It's just forming. And as a new religious movement, often it's actually a branch off of an existing group. So it doesn't have everything you might expect in a full-blown religion. Some of the older ones certainly do, so that the new religious movements which formed 50, 60 years ago are indistinguishable from any other world religions. But the new ones that are in the act of forming maybe don't have it all quite figured out just yet. And they're often fun to study as a scholar, to look at a religion as it's forming.
Are there any contemporary examples of that kind of inchoate religious group that's maybe not quite what people would expect to see as a religion, but...
Yeah. A lot of the really good examples are actually in Eastern Europe and former Soviet areas, because there had been this real sort of enforced lack of religion, right? So then as after the fall of the Soviet Union and after the end of sort of enforced atheism, there was this spiritual yearning. And we see all these sort of new religions that are popping up all over Eastern Europe and in Russia. Often they do have a charismatic leader, or they have sort of a sacred text. But sort of the practices and the communities are sort of always shifting in terms of they really haven't nailed down exactly what the groups are about. But there's often sort of this spiritual quest. China is a big example too. There's a number of sort of Chinese leaders. I was just reading an article that we have in press in the journal I co-edit, which is on new religious movements. It's called Nova Religio, and we have a new article coming out about some of these sort of Chinese new religious movements, which often fuse aspects of Confucianism, of Taoism, but also Maoism and state religion as well. So it's a state sort of civic religion. So there's all sorts of groups. The U.S., it's a little more, our new religions are sort of the older ones, or they're really under the radar. A lot of the groups are groups I just haven't heard of yet, because if they have 50, 100 members and they're tucked away somewhere, they haven't done anything to attract much interest. How would I know about them?
Right. Yeah, and I think one of the reasons why I think people are interested in new religious movements and how they come to be known is, unfortunately, through violence.
Yeah. The ones we know about are the ones that do something spectacularly bad, usually.
Right. Yeah. Are there particular factors that are maybe you could say necessary, but not sufficient perhaps for violence to manifest in these religions?
Yeah, there's been a lot of research done on this by sociologists, by historians, by psychologists. It's really hard to tell because there's really very few examples. If we were natural scientists working in a lab, it would be like trying to make some sort of statement about cellular biology by looking at only 10 cells. There's basically no more than a dozen or so new religious movements which have been involved in any level of sort of collective group violence. There are many new religious movements that had individual members who were accused of violent crimes, but that's true of every religion. And we have to distinguish between a religion which has some sort, or a religious movement which has some sort of violence attached to it, and a group which happens to have a member who did something violent that doesn't connect to the religion. So, but of the groups we've looked at, and there's a few big ones. You mentioned Jonestown, Jonestown People's Temple, the Branch Davidians with the big siege in Waco, mid-90s. Aum Shinrikyo you mentioned as well. Solar Temple, which was a Francophone new religious movement, had suicides and murder, Heaven's Gate. The Ugandan example is the movement for the restoration of the Ten Commandments of God. But really beyond that, it's hard to think of a lot of such groups. The commonalities we do see are there are internal factors which led to either some sort of collapse or some sort of opening up for problems. And then there's usually external factors as well.
Okay.
And it's when you have both internal factors and external factors lining up that you have real propensity for violence or tragedy. And very rare examples.
So I guess one example would be like in Jonestown, where you had the senator come and visit them, right, which played into this narrative about persecution by the government.
So exactly, really good example. So Jonestown, you had internal factors. So you had Jim Jones, who seemed to be getting increasingly paranoid, perhaps with or without reason, thinking that the CIA was out to get him. They relocate to South America. They think World War III is coming. They think that a race war is coming. Remember, they were an interracial group right in the 70s. So they thought that the white government, the man, was going to come and get them. And then what happened? The man came to get them as far as they were concerned, right? So you happen to the internal and external factors line up together, where all of their fears were played into, where Jones and sort of his lieutenants really thought that the U.S. government was going to come and get them. And all of a sudden they see the senator show up with the press, and they think that it's happening, and they're afraid their group is going to spiral out of their control, and they're all going to be arrested and thrown into prisons. They thought they were going to be enslaved. They thought they were just going to be, snuck off and executed in the middle of the jungle somewhere. And they decided to take matters into their own hands. And you have the cases of the murder-suicides. I mean, those weren't just suicides. Those were clearly murders as well.
Right.
And the internal and external factors lined up, perfectly from an academic perspective. Obviously, it wasn't a perfect thing, but